Thanks very much, Patsy. First and last reference to Waterford hurling. In the book that I've just done, and I think there may be a couple of copies up there, on the front is a wrecked train that was wrecked during the Civil War. And when I was launching the book last week, I pointed out to the people, which included the attendants, which included some Cork men, that train was not the train bringing Cork supporters back to Cork last Sunday week. On that, enough of that. Now, there's no need for me to talk about the significance of Tuesday, January the 21st. The opening shots of the War of Independence at Solohead Beg, and in the parallel political dimension of the War of Independence, the first meeting of Dáil Éireann. Now, Brian Farrell talks about that first meeting of Dáil Éireann, and he talks about the massive crowd in Dawson Street. And he says, outside in Dawson Street, the crowd pressed right across the road, climbed the lamppost for a glimpse of the arriving leaders. Volunteers preserved a good-natured order, and a detachment of the Dublin Metropolitan Police managed to keep the trams running. So he paints a picture of Dawson Street with a massive crowd there for the first meeting of the Dáil, and you can see down below at the front of the stage, appropriately, a photograph of that first meeting of the Dáil. But what nobody has ever alluded to is the simple fact that that first meeting of the Dáil was delayed for a few minutes. It was delayed because there was another function going on in the Mansion House that same day. And that function was a welcome home dinner for returning Dublin Fusiliers, for returning ex-servicemen. And that dinner was for the prisoners of war who had been the first to be demobilised. And according to contemporary newspapers, as the 400 plus ex-Dublin Fusiliers emerged from the Mansion House, the crowd of Sinn Féin supporters respectfully stood to one side, and some of them applauded the Dublin Fusiliers as they marched off down to the Theatre Royal for a concert. An amazing coincidence of events. The Lord Lieutenant, Lord French, mentions there he sent his apologies that he could not attend. Now that would have been interesting if the Lord Lieutenant had been coming out of the Mansion House. Martin Savage might have done the job earlier. Now, demobilisation. I think it's important to put all of this in the context. In November 1918, the British Army numbered some 3.7 million men. The British Army drew up a wonderful plan to slowly demobilise them and to send them back to their communities. Lloyd George and the government wouldn't wear it. They had promised a home fit for heroes and that the heroes would come home very quickly. As a result, within 12 months, the British Army was down to 795,000, and in a further 12 months, was down to 368,000. And that caused massive problems for the British Army, which I'll come back to later. So, most of this demobilisation took place in the first 6 months. It was a massive exercise and a massive social programme of all of these men coming home. So how many came home to Ireland? Under the demobilisation, you moved to a camp where you were given a briefing, as we heard, and you were given a suit of civilian clothes, you were given your gratuity, you were given a travel warrant to wherever you wanted to go to. About 80,000 were demobilised in Ireland, and another 86,000 were demobilised in Wales and took travel warrants for Ireland. So we estimate that approximately 166,000 came home to Ireland in that 6 months, which is a huge movement of labour, if you like. Now, most of them would have come home to the cities and towns of Ireland. I won't go over the First World War period, but most of them came home to the cities, as I say, the cities and the towns. In the case of Waterford, they came home to Dungarvan, to Waterford City especially, and to the lesser towns. Because throughout the war, and this is reflected in every county, the farmers did not join up. Farmers' sons did not join up, and very few rural labourers joined up. The reason was they were doing very well economically out of the war. And there's one comment that I came across, the local county inspector, where he says, the farmers are doing exceptionally well out of the war, but they're not sharing their newfound wealth with their labourers. They were still being paid a pittance. So they came home to the towns and to the cities. Now, the first thing I want to really talk about is the employment situation. A few months ago, Stephen Collins, the political editor of the Irish Times, did an article on his family. And his grandfather's family from Waterford, the Collinses of Phillip Street, near where I grew up, there were 6 sons in the family. 2 more were born afterwards. But of those 6 joined up. 4 were killed. 1 was badly wounded. And the other came home. And what Stephen Collins said was, he came home to unemployment because he was an ex-British soldier. They were not employable, and he consequently emigrated. I would suggest that there was no conscious bias against British soldiers, especially in the early years after the war. I would suggest that those who had left a job to join the British Army, and an awful lot did so, came home to that same job. Employers both in the public service and in the private service honoured the commitment that they had given that the jobs would be kept for them. But an awful lot had joined up from unemployment. There had been chronic unemployment in Waterford before the war. They joined up for economic reasons. As Pádraig emphasised, there was an economic dimension to joining up. Those who had left unemployment came home to unemployment, by and large. It wasn't that there were ex-British soldiers, it was simply there weren't any jobs, or there weren't very many jobs. And just to put, as an aside, to put a figure on the economic impact. A pre-war labourer, casual labourer in Waterford, if he was lucky enough to get work 6 days a week, and that's a 9-hour day each of those 6 days, he took home 18 shillings. And from that, he would have had to support his wife and, say, 3 kids. And out of that 18 shillings, he too had to be fed and watered and looked after. If he joined up between separation money, children's allowances, deductions, etc., his wife at home got 23 shillings a week. And she didn't have to feed him or give him money for a few bottles of stout or anything. Economically, she was so much better off. And to refer again to what Sean said this morning, the Bishop of Waterford found it necessary in his Lenten pastoral in March 1915 to warn the women of Waterford about abusing their newfound wealth, spending some of it in public houses, etc. And he called upon the local education authorities to provide classes so that women of Waterford could be educated in the use of money. Don't think you get away with it nowadays. But as a further aside, I remember my grandmother telling me once that a neighbour of hers in 1917 had gone up to the parish priest of Ballybricken and had given him a shilling to say mass for the health of the Kaiser, that the war would last forever. She was so much better off Now, it's very difficult to track down private employment, but I've come across evidence that in the railways, now there was a slight boom in employment after the railways after the war, because the unions there had won the 8-hour day. It came down from 9 hours to 8 hours a day, and that created vacancies. And what I found was that in the locomotive depot in Waterford, 66% of those who got jobs in the railway, and the railway was a prestigious employment, 66% of those were ex-servicemen. That's discrimination in favour of ex-servicemen. As I said, they came home to the jobs that they had. That's Larry Griffin. Served in the Royal Artillery before the war, served in India, came home, was demobilised, left the army. He was recalled as a reservist. He served in France for 4 years, came home after the war, resumed his job as a postman, and 10 years later he disappeared on Christmas Day in Stradbally. That's the missing postman, or the famous missing postman. So I'd come back to the railways, and unfortunately that did not come out as well as I had thought. Not only did the railways not only did they honour their promise to give men their jobs back, but they had decided that every returning soldier would get a gratuity of £10, which was a month's wages when they rejoined the railway. That's a letter from a wounded ex-soldier. He was so badly wounded they couldn't find a job for him on the railway. I would say more in hope than in expectation, he wrote in asking for the £10 gratuity. And what did the railway do? What did the Great Southern Railway do? Scroll across the bottom the same day, special gratuity, £20 approved. That's not discrimination against ex-soldiers. Socially, they were honoured. Lismore, a small parish, they had their roll of honour. Johnny Graves, the biggest builder, who had done well out of the war in terms of wartime contracts, etc., had his roll of honour of all the men from his company who joined up. So, in a way, they're being honoured, those who had left jobs and who came back to those same jobs. Politics was different. And here's where Waterford was different from everywhere else. In 1918, in March 1918, John Redmond, who had represented Waterford, and there was an incredible bond of loyalty between John Redmond and Waterford. When Redmond died, he died in London. His body lay in state in Westminster Abbey. It was brought back to Dublin and then brought down to his native Wexford for burial. As the corpse was being carried down the church, it wasn't carried by family members or members of the IPP or Wexford men. It was carried down the church by 8 members of the legendary Waterford Pig Buyers Association, which was the political and economic dominant force in Waterford City. You had a by-election then, which was noted for its violence. 3 weeks of unbelievable violence, street violence, in March 1918. The violence stopped on Patrick's Day as a kind of a truce and resumed the next day. De Valera was assaulted by the women of Ballybricken. There's vivid descriptions of him being rescued, his coat torn, his head gone, his hat gone, not his head, his hat gone, and Redmond won that by-election. With the repeat of violence and so on like that afterwards, the violence continued, and in November 1918, Captain Redmond retained that seat. the only one outside of Ulster to be won by the Irish Parliamentary Party. In his speech, Captain Redmond referred to it as Waterford as an oasis in the political desert that is Ireland. Captain Redmond represented Waterford in the House of Parliament until 1922 and in the Dáil from 1923 to 1932, and he was assiduous in trying to look after the interests of the ex-servicemen, of all ex-servicemen, but particularly those in Waterford. Now, there's a name there, William Grant. And just to give you an idea, returning soldiers linked up with the Redmondite organisation and in a way provided muscle to that electoral organisation. The street violence would sooner or later end in tragedy. And in April 1919, a row started in the city. The usual trading of the verbal insults, up Redmond, up Sinn Féin, up De Valera, etc. Words, blows followed words, and at the end of it, William Grant, an ex-soldier, was dead on the ground. Killed, according to the medical inquest, probably with a blow of a bottle to the head. The RIC noted that although there were hundreds present who had witnessed the attack, nobody would testify and nobody was ever accused of it. But my point is, in Waterford, particularly in the city, the ex-soldiers came home to a different political environment than to any other part of nationalist Ireland. In Waterford City, you could be a nationalist and not support Sinn Féin. And that was crucial in that period in Waterford City. That's Captain Redmond in his uniform as an officer of the Irish Guards. And in both the by-election and in the general election, he canvassed in his uniform, emphasising the point that he was a serving officer and that there was this link with the families of the soldiers and with the soldiers and ex-soldiers themselves. Also, of course, you had the social outlets, and there was the British Legion band, and the banners at the back refer to the Collins brothers that I referred to earlier. I had a photograph, but unfortunately I couldn't find it when I was preparing this, which shows the Sinn Féin pipe band, and that numbered 7 pipers and 2 drummers. I think there were, at least in the battle of the bands, the Redmondites clearly won, and you can see it there. Now, so my point would be that the vast majority of the ex-servicemen in Waterford settled into what they had left, if that was a job or if it was unemployment, and settled into the old mould of politics in Waterford City, which was Redmondism. However, there was I want to talk about 2 minorities. One, the minority that joined the IRA. And there's 2 different experiences here, which again is illustrative. Waterford, for IRA purposes, was organised into 2 brigades. The first, the Eastern Brigade, the City Brigade, 1st, 2nd and 3rd Battalions seen there on the right, and it was one of the weakest brigades in the country. At its peak it numbered perhaps 500 men, and there was always this consciousness they had not won the political battle. The Western Brigade was much bigger, much more active, and performed quite well in the War of Independence. That was under the command of Pax Sweden. A number, I haven't been able to quantify it, but a significant number of ex-soldiers joined the IRA. John Reardon, seen there, had joined pre-wars regular, had joined the Royal Irish Regiment, the local regiment in Waterford. The depot was in Clonmel, served throughout the war, came home in 1919, was a friend of Pax Whelan, joined the volunteers, and initially was used as a training officer. For over a year, he was used purely for training. Before, in November 1920, he joined the Active Service Unit, took part in the Piltown ambush and a number of other actions. He was lifted in 1921, interned in Ballykindler, almost made his escape from Ballykindler using his experiences as a soldier, because unlike the others who tried to escape from Ballykindler, he didn't try to escape from the prisoner of war camp directly to the outside. He very cleverly escaped into the adjoining British Army camp, and then posing as a soldier with his experience, got past the first two gates, but was unfortunately, he was outside the gate when he was discovered and brought back. But I would put it to you that his experience was typical. Training, the volunteers used the experience of ex-British Army men primarily for training, and then, in a sense, when they had proved themselves, they went on to the Active Service Unit and so on like that. Declan Horton was similar. Served in the British Army, came home to his job, which was a postman in Ardmore, joined the volunteers, training officer in the local company, then participated in a number of attacks. Again, this sequence, you're a training officer first, you demonstrate your abilities, your loyalty, then you become active service. Arrested, also did his time in Ballykindler, but he had a tragic end. 2 days after the truce was signed, the internees in Ballykindler were released. They travelled by special train to Dublin, and from there he took a train down to Cork, because the easiest way to get to Ardmore was by train from Dublin to Cork, from Cork to Youghal, and then walk to Ardmore. He got off the train in Thurles, we don't know why, to stretch his legs or whatever, and an RIC man threw a grenade at the group of returning internees, and Declan Horton was killed. And that's his gravestone in Ardmore, killed 2 days after the truce by a random act by an RIC sergeant, who was subsequently shot by the Mid-Tip Brigade. Now, Pádraig in his map showed, I think, one ex-soldier being killed in Waterford, and that was William Moran. And here again, this is shrouded in mystery. William Moran, in April 1921, a knock came to his door in what was then Lord Beresford Lane. He went out. Next morning, at the bottom of the lane, his body was found with the usual placard, "Spies and informers beware, IRA." William Moran was 65 years old. His military service predated the Boer War. He had been living in that lane in Dungarvan for more than 30 years. Talking to people, and nobody wants to talk about the killing of William Moran in Dungarvan. Nobody will talk about it. One of the things that was suggested to me that I should look at is under IRA standing orders, executions like that had to be sanctioned by the brigade. Somebody said to me that all the brigade officers were out of the town that night at a meeting outside the county. They used that. There is certainly no evidence whatsoever to suggest that William Moran was an informer. I think it was opportunistic violence and the settling of some personal score. We will never know. But when it does come to informers, only once in all of the statements and everything that I came across was there a reference to a British ex-soldier possibly being an informer. And according to the source, a conversation with his family in Cappoquin stopped it. So he couldn't have been much of an informer, that's for sure. Equally, in the reorganisation of the Waterford brigades during the truce, a great emphasis was put on making sure that an intelligence network was up to speed and had all the information. And it was asked to list all suspected informers. And it listed about 30 of them, usually gentry, justices of the peace, and so on. Not one of them was an ex-soldier. So it seems to me that most of them came back and blended in and just got on with their lives, whether that was their job or unemployment. But East Waterford was slightly different. Paddy Paul had joined the Royal Irish Regiment in 1915, aged 19. He didn't do it for economic reasons. He came from a wealthy middle-class family, and he responded to John Redmond's call to fight for Catholic Belgium. He was commissioned, served in Salonika, served in Egypt, and came home in 1919. He joined the volunteers in 1919. Within 6 months, he was battalion commander in Waterford, and within a further 8 months, by November 1920, he is the brigade commander. An incredibly rapid rise through the ranks. Now, in particularly in Waterford City, he set out to recruit ex-soldiers on the basis of their experience. And among those that he recruited, and Tim Horgan, I know, would be familiar with the name, was Michael Bishop, or Stan Bishop, as he was often referred to, who joined up. He had been decorated twice, had served in the Irish Guards, joined the volunteers. He would later get quite an unsavoury reputation in Kerry. Now, in January 1921, Paddy Paul organised the first large-scale action in Waterford. It was the Pickettstown ambush. It was a shambles. It ended as a shambles. 2 IRA men dead, 2 more seriously wounded, no casualties at all on the British side. So much so that the GHQ found it necessary to carry out an investigation into it. While that investigation was going on, Paddy Paul decided to mount an even bigger operation. On March the 9th, he decided that that night every British Army post in the East Waterford area and police post would be attacked. He gathered the men, briefed them, gave them all jobs, and the centrepiece was to be a large-scale ambush on a British Army patrol in the streets in central Waterford. On the night, there was a few preliminaries like raising the bridge in Waterford. There wasn't a shot fired. The following day, Paddy Paul started to make inquiries. He found that his vice brigadier, William Keane, had gone around the city over the previous 2 days saying, "Do you want to get yourself shot for Paddy Paul, for an ex-British Army officer?" And as a result, nothing happened. Paul immediately sacked William Keane and replaced him with Michael Bishop. All the officers, with the exception of Paul and Bishop, in East Waterford, held a meeting and wrote to GHQ saying they were ready to do great things, but they wouldn't do it for Paddy Paul. And of course, the war of words followed between the 2 factions. Paddy Paul was ex-British Army. His family had always been a Redmondite, etc., etc. It ended up with further investigations into it. But my point, and the amalgamation of the 2 brigades under the command of Pax Phelan, and with Paddy Paul now the training officer. My point being, when there was a failure, and particularly a disastrous failure, being and having served in the British Army could be used as a term of abuse, as a blame that Paddy Paul didn't really want to fight the British Army. So there was that side of it too. And as a result, the East Waterford Brigade, just put it mildly, was a bit of a shambles throughout the War of Independence. Now, that's one minority. But there was another minority. Think of these unemployed ex-soldiers. And think of the two traditional routes for employment for casual labourers, for workers in the cities. Emigration, which resumed, and joining the British Army. Sorry, there's Paddy Paul there. He's seated, second from the left. The small man is there. There's some wonderful stories about him that I won't go into, but there he is seated there, as I say, second from the left, with the other members of the East Waterford Brigade, and that was taken during the truce. The other outlet was to join the British Army. And there you see the recruiting districts. The Munster Fusiliers Recruiting District, the 101st, which covered Cork, Kerry, Tipperary and Limerick. And the 18th, which covered, Cork, Limerick, Kerry and Clare were the Munsters. The Royal Irish Regiment covered Tipperary, Waterford, Kilkenny and Wexford. Because of that rapid decline and reduction in the British Army, after the war, not only had the British Army the old empire to police, but they'd also had taken over Mesopotamia or Iraq. There was a rebellion there. They had to find an army of occupation for Germany and for Istanbul. There was a rebellion in Egypt, etc., etc. Rebellion in India as well. So they needed more soldiers. So they launched a massive recruiting campaign. And in the period 1919 to 1921, 22,268 Irishmen in Ireland joined the British Army. So while thousands were joining the IRA, others, and I will suggest to you, driven primarily by economic forces, joined the British Army. In the 18th, and I only have figures for half of 1920 and half of 1921, and this is Waterford, Tipperary, 1,446 joined. In Cork, Kerry, Limerick and Clare, 2,000 joined. And it wasn't just the local regiments that they joined. The Devonshire Regiment was a British Army unit based in Waterford during the War of Independence. And according to their regimental records, a small but fairly steady number of recruits trickling in at Waterford City. They are mostly men who had already served in the army and failed to get employment after demobilisation. Now, that's important. Unfortunately, I've never been able to find the enlistment books which will give details. But anecdotally, there is huge information that would suggest that unlike the other units in the British Army, recruits from Ireland tended to be ex-soldiers who couldn't get employment. McCann, in his history of the Munster Fusiliers, talks about the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Munster Fusiliers in India. And he says, we were the finest in India because out of 1,000 men, over 900 had previously served. Men rejoining. The Dublin Fusiliers, their commanding officer, a man named Bonham Carter, noted that his battalion consisted of half and half rejoined ex-soldiers, the finest in the earth, and he said the other half were some of the worst corner boys from Dublin. In a way, it was a traditional mix. But of the Connaught Rangers who mutinied, just over half of them were ex-soldiers who had rejoined after the war. So again, you get these. So that's the re-enlistments. People who came home couldn't get a job because there wasn't any employment, not because they were ex-soldiers, and who went back to the only trade they knew, which was soldiering for the British Army. Now, things changed, of course, after the treaty. The Civil War created a huge temporary demand for trained soldiers, and an awful lot of ex-British Army soldiers joined the Free State Army. And that, of course, caused its own problems when the Free State Army started to demobilise at the end of 1923 and led to the so-called Army Mutiny in 1924. Also, you had a continuing recruitment. You had a continuing flow of men from the south of Ireland who continued to join the British forces. And of course we know that it was because of his alleged involvement in that Admiral Somerville was killed in Cork. So my point would be, I don't believe in this wholesale discrimination. All across Europe, millions of men were being demobilised. That in itself created social problems. But I would suggest that, as in most of Europe, the men came home, went back to what they had been at, and just got on with living. A number joined the IRA, a bigger number, certainly in Waterford, rejoined the British Army. And so it continued. Thanks.